Hi everyone, I'm the Jungle Goddess and welcome back to my kitchen. I'm a culinary wellness coach and I'm helping you find gut-brain happiness. So I'm sharing culinary wellness hints and tips every week, and today I'm going to introduce you to sauerkraut. So sauerkraut is really what started me on my journey to culinary wellness. I'd heard about the benefits for gut health and I started fermenting, probably 10 years ago. So fermented foods are really good for the gut microbiome, the colony of bacteria and yeasts, viruses. There's many different microorganisms that make up our microbiome, but it's important for our health. We have a symbiotic relationship with the microbiome and it has far-reaching effects on our health. There's also a link between the gut and the brain, and microbes in our gut can affect our mood, they can affect different brain function, and there's even links with brain disorders like Alzheimer's. So sauerkraut is it's a good bacteria. You can buy it in the supermarket. If you're buying it, make sure it's in the refrigerated section. If it's not, then it's pasteurized. So that means there's nothing live in it. It doesn't mean to say that you're not getting any benefit from it, because the fermentation process actually makes a lot of the nutrients more bioavailable to us. But you're not going to have that those live probiotics. So basically all plant life has lactobacillus, which is a bacteria that fuels the fermentation process. And so all we need, sauerkraut at its most basic, is cabbage and salt, nothing else. So we're doing a nice simple sauerkraut here, but you're limited by your imagination. You can use herbs and spices, you can use other vegetables. Some of the ingredients that I'll use in mine are beetroots, carrots, ginger, Indian spices. Jerusalem artichoke is a really good vegetable to use because it's a prebiotic. Prebiotic is what the probiotics feed off of. So when we're fermenting, basically you want to finely shred your cabbage. If there's any big bits, just go through afterwards and you can break them up a little. And what I've got here is 800 grams of shredded cabbage. I have a 1 litre clip jar, and I'll come to these in a moment. And I've got salt. I'm using a Celtic grey salt here. And really you want to use 1.5 to 2% of salt to your weight ratio. Now, all salt is different. It all weighs different. So in a lot of recipes that you'll see, it will say 1 tablespoon of salt. Well, 1 tablespoon of salt crystals or salt flakes is a lot lighter than a tablespoon of rock salt, for example, like pink Himalayan. So it's important to know what your salt weighs. Now I've got on my YouTube channel, I've got a video all about salt and the differences and how to work it all out. But I know that this, having weighed it previously, 1 tablespoon of this is the right amount for this amount of cabbage. So basically I'll put a tablespoon of salt on it. And then I want to mix that salt in. Now the salt is going to have an action on the cabbage where it draws the juices out of the cabbage. And it's those juices that we use to submerge the cabbage. So the fermentation process with sauerkraut is lactofermentation. So it's lactic acid that is creating an environment that will eventually will ferment and get the food to a level of which it can be preserved. Because that's why something sauerkraut originated in the first place. It was a way to preserve autumn harvest throughout the winter, so that people would have fresh, a form of fresh food throughout winter. Now, lactic fermentation has to happen in an environment without oxygen. So we push it down into a jar, and we use the juices to cover the cabbage. Now it's important that the cabbage is submerged. Any cabbage that isn't submerged is at risk of mold. The oxygen-free environment is what keeps out the bad bacteria. And also the action of the lactic acid, because that reduces the pH in the ferment and again makes it more unfriendly for the bad bacteria. Now, there's 3 different stages of fermentation. So the first stage is there's a type of bacteria that goes in and eats the oxygen that remains in the ferment. Once all of that oxygen is eaten, then those bacteria die off. The next stage is the bubbling stage. And that's where you need to be most vigilant, because what you've got is, as the bacteria eats the sugar, which is what it's doing in the sauerkraut, it produces carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide forces the cabbage up and can bring it above the liquid level. So what it is important to do is to weigh it down. So once you've got your cabbage to a point, what you're doing is you're massaging this cabbage, and you can see the liquid coming out of it. We're then going to pack the jar. So it's important to pack the jar tightly, because you want to get rid of all of the oxygen in there, or as much as possible. Then you have to weigh it down. So really, don't be light about this, really push it down. It's not going to affect the cabbage at all. And about 800 grams of cabbage should be suitable for a 1 litre clip jar, because we're not going to fill it right up to the top. We'll fill it to within about 1 inch or so, which is what we call head space. You want to keep the head space small, because the more head space you've got, the more air you've got in there, and the more risk of pathogens. So nowadays, airlock fermenting has become really popular because it minimises the risk. When you're if you're not using airlock, you just need to be more vigilant to make sure that your cabbage stays below the liquid level. So let's force this down. Now, the action of the salt will continue over the next 24 hours. So if the liquid hasn't reached the top of the cabbage by the time you're finished, don't worry about it. Wait until the next day, and you'll probably find that the liquid level has risen up and covered it. And that's because that salt action is still ongoing. If it doesn't cover it, then just top it up with a little bit of brine. So a salt water mixture in a ratio of 2% salt. Now I'm using an organic cabbage here. Organic is always best. And you know, especially when you know where it comes from, because the risk of non-organic is the pesticides. Also, the food can be irradiated, and irradiated food is designed to kill off the bacteria, and we want active bacteria. So once you've packed it all in there, you want to weigh it down. So as I said, when it gets bubbling, the gas, if it's not weighed down, that gas is going to force this up. So you can buy things like pickle weights. So this is a pickle weight. Or, I'm sure plenty of you have got these at home. This is a GU jar, so it's one of the GU desserts. And they fit perfectly into these. And then what happens is that lid pushes down on the jar and forces it in. So as you can see, that liquid is coming up. So the liquid is covering all of the cabbage. So there's no oxygen in this area. Well, there's tiny little bubbles, and that's that first stage of fermenting is going to eat the oxygen in those bubbles. What can happen is this can come up to the seal. So I would put it onto a plate, but you don't need to open it. Gas is going to create, and the beauty of these clip jars is this seal allows gas to come out, but not air to go in. So it's keeping it in a controlled environment. Now that third stage of fermentation is really where the lactic acid multiplies. The pH of the ferment drops to a point between 3.1 and 3.7, and it's that preserves the food. So that it's an environment that is extremely uninviting to bad bacteria, and then basically as long as you're keeping the level, the ingredients covered in liquid, then it's fine. What they would do, they would make it in big crocks, and they'd pull back cabbage leaves, they'd scoop out some of the ferment, push the cabbage leaves back, seal the crock, eat the sauerkraut, go back for more. So that's basically how you make sauerkraut. I've used 3/4 of a cabbage there. That cabbage cost me £1.50. The salt marginal amount is going to cost you a clip jar, which you might have anyway, and a weight. Fermenting is really cheap to do yourself. It's expensive to buy. So I really encourage people to make it themselves. It's a great activity if you've got kids, especially when this starts bubbling. Be careful when you open it because it will release gas. And really that second stage, so the first stage is 2 or 3 days. The bubbling phase is probably up to about 8 or 10 days. And then the third phase to really get a good sauerkraut is 3 to 4 weeks plus. So I wouldn't open it for at least 3 weeks. Probably nearer 4, and it keeps so long. I have sauerkraut that's a year old. It keeps so well if you take the time and do the full ferment. So that's sauerkraut. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do next week, but if you want to know more about different ways in which you can make sauerkraut, then just let me know. Thanks for watching.